All farm stands. You've seen them all over the rural countryside of northern New England. They are rapidly disappearing now. Usually, there are a few scrub acres of brush that have grown up near a set of collapsing buildings. The house may have a slate roof, the barn rusting tin, and if there is a silo, the top is missing and leans away from the wind. Desolate, lonely, and abandoned, it sits back from the road. The buildings are waiting to be demolished or restored, depending on the new owner's resources. I was in the town clerk's office, looking through my ancestors' records from this area. The men in the family had left to build boats on the coast of southern New England. The men left with their families. This occurred in a hurry as Hitler began to devour Europe. The homes and farms were sold for pennies, or simply abandoned to be returned to when the war ended. Few people returned. Many young people left their blood on distant shores, or had it diluted by seawater. The fish consumed their remains. The older people and women remembered the hard life on the Scrabble farms, and found it easier to live in cities. I grew up hearing about some of the good times from my grandmother, and I wanted to experience them for myself. Perhaps it was just nostalgia, but she brought it to life for me. The kitchen dances, taffy pulling, sewing bees, corn husking, and, of course, fresh meat. After the hog was slaughtered and the steer butchered. So here I was, in the North Country, not far north. I happened upon a tax sale listing for an 87-acre farm. The property's description and location were noted. My taxes for the last 3 years totaled less than a month's salary. The owner's name was the same as mine, Philip James. I was looking for a record of one of my ancestors with this name. If this great-great-uncle I knew was still alive, he would be 92 years old. The town clerk was friendly, and we had already talked. I asked about my grandmother and her people. I asked if she knew anything about the man, and she said yes, she did. He was currently living in a nursing home and despised it. She implied that he was an irascible old bastard who might be kicked out of the house. I then inquired whether the farm's sale could be halted if the taxes had been paid up to the last minute before the auctioneer brought it up for sale. She informed me that the auction was in 2 weeks, so if I was interested, I should act quickly. When I got outside, I told Patsy, my wife, that I had found a surviving relative and wanted to visit him at the nursing home. I could hear someone cursing as we approached the desk to inquire. Nurses and attendants ran around with red faces. I asked for Philip. James, are you a relative? Not wanting to get too involved, I responded. Maybe I hope so, because we're releasing him this afternoon. Nobody can stand him. He's been here a week, which is long enough. He chases the women, and I don't mean those who are already taken care of. He is also after the nurses. How does he go? Simply follow the cursing, and you will find him. Do not get too close to him. He might bite. He's threatened to. I entered his room. He had a nurse and an aide backing his wheelchair into a corner. I watched him for a moment before remembering that Grandma gave him a nickname. Uncle Bert let the ladies leave. You know better than to treat a woman that way. He swung around. He reminded me of my father. Who are you? I am your nephew. Philip doesn't have one. Yes, you do. I'm Maisie's son. Get Maisie. I remember her. How is she? Dead. Figures. You want to get me out of here and back home? Do you want me to? Yeah. Okay, then I'll have them pack your things. You will need to tell me where you live. Don't you know much? I know enough to get you out of a situation you do not want to be in. I suppose you do, boy, and I thank you. I pulled into the overgrown dooryard. The house was typical of New Englanders. Huge, and definitely had better days. For several decades, it did not appear to have been repaired. It had once been yellow, but it had been so long ago that it only appeared under the eaves where the weather did not hit it directly. One window was broken, with a rag fluttering from it. The roof itself appeared tight, but the ridgepole sagged under the weight of the slate roof. God, I'm glad I'm back where I am. Quiet. I'm not sure how people can make so much noise. Come in. I hope those who took me away did not raid the pantry. I have tea and coffee stashed. I hope you prefer it black. Black is best. There was no lock on the door, just a pull string. He pushed it open, and it swung closed on its own as we entered. Shit! Somebody turn off the gas. Wait right here. I will turn it on. I followed him as he hobbled through a dark hallway and out a back door to a single propane tank. I was glad I was with him because his hands lacked the strength to turn the tank valve. When we got back to the kitchen, he found a match and went to the stove. Patsy ran her hands over the beautiful green enamel stove, admiring it. Wood in the front, gas burners in the back. We don't need wood. Great thing about gas. I didn't set it up this year. I figured I would die before I needed it. It is probably hot enough where I am going anyway. Old Philip cackled, as if he had told the best joke. Where do you want your wheelchair? I'd left it in the car. The nurse had insisted that I bring it with me when we left the house. I don't need the damn thing. I keep bumping into things. This house was built for such a foolish thing. Takes up too much room. When I get tired, I will sit in a chair like everyone else. Patsy brewed coffee and looked around for food. As the saying goes, the pantry was empty. Philip looked at me. Do you have money? I have no food and no money for provisions. He gave me a hopeful look. Sure. What would you like to eat? What I like and what I can do. It kind of limits me. Go to the market and get some burgers. Get the cheapest price available. That has the highest fat and flavor content. Grab some onions. And if they have any bright red tomatoes, I'd like one of them to make sure they're ripe. I don't eat half-ripe fruits like they did at home. Home? That wasn't even close to being home. This is home. I have lived here my entire life. Born here. I was. It must have been almost 90 years ago. You'll be 93 on October 20. How do you know this? I received the family Bible from my grandmother Maisie. Oh yes. Family. Aren't you? Are you going after that food? I am hungry. Leave this lovely little lady here when you leave. I enjoy a beautiful woman. Help me find wives. I did some good and some bad. But they all want to get into bed with me. I doubt that will happen. You and I mean, he looked at Patsy. Patsy's face was red. The arrogance of the old bastard. Nope. I am taken. Well, I believe you've changed your mind. We will find time. I headed to the store, chuckling to myself. This elderly man was my grandmother's uncle. The way he spoke caused a lump in my throat. Graham, talk like that. I'm curious what plan brought me to town today to discover the family history hidden in the body of this old cuss. It could not have been God's plan. Perhaps it was the devil. However, I was relieved to be here because the old place would have been lost forever in 2 weeks. I was going to make an offer to the old guy. How could he refuse? I was a family member. When Patsy was cooking his hamburger, old Philip stood right over her. He wanted it half raw, with any tallow that leaked out drizzled over a piece of bread. His body must have been resistant to cholesterol. It smelled good, especially when he told him to fry his onions in the pan after the majority of the grease had been poured over his bread. I have to have my vegetables, you know. Good for you. Keeps the body going. Are you a man who drinks? I have some cider jugs in the cellar. It will put a man straight to sleep. I don't use it anymore. Sleep is already too much. Must be getting old. I sleep in a room off the kitchen. I don't think you'd want to change the sheets for me, ma'am. It's hard for me to do. Start with one side of the bed, then the other. I haven't been here more than a week, and the dampness has most likely seeped into the bed. It makes me miserable if it gets into my bones. You can sleep at the top of the stairs. If you pound too hard, the bed will rattle, but it will not bother me at all. I will be sleeping. Patsy and I spoke after she had put old Philip to bed. He was in tears of gratitude when he thanked me for finding him and bringing him home. I adore the elderly gentleman. You were planning to buy the property if he sold, aren't you? Chris and Dela will adore him. I wish they were with us. I'll see if we can't stay here. You can do your writing, and I'll take the summer off to listen to him, if he will let me. She giggled. See? I can even speak like him. Let's see what we can do. You want to see if this bed rattles as much as he claims it does? Why not? We talked after breakfast, which included fried eggs and fresh pork that I had bought the night before. His slang and dialect had significantly decreased, and when I mentioned it, his eyes twinkled. I was just putting on a show until I determined whether you were family or not. You won't believe the number of city slickers who come to my door, hoping to pull a fast one. One thing I would like to know. Why is your name the same as mine if you are Maisie's son's boy? It's not possible. So, you have some explaining to do. No. Philip James is my name. Not necessarily all of it. It's Philip James Hammond. My dad's name was James Hammond. I am a writer, and I write under the name Philip James. What do you write? I've never heard of you. Most of the articles are from magazines. My book is currently being printed. I'm not sure how it'll sell, but my publisher is very excited. Do you know any more about my family? I made up a family tree. That is why I am in town. I was searching for my ancestors. Let me go get it. It's out in the car. You can help me fill in some of the blanks. Philip knew the majority of my ancestors personally, and told story after story about the various ones. As I had suspected, this was the family home. It had been purchased in the 1800s, and the 1920s saw a rise in large families. Some had left the farm, and the majority of the rest had left in the 1930s and early 1940s to work in factories and shipyards. By 1945, only he and another brother remained. He had been married several times, but had no children. He had gradually lost track of all of his relatives. I was the first to contact him in over 30 years. Phil, Do you have money? Enough to save the homeless from the vultures down at town hall. If you can raise enough funds, I'll sell you the place. For how much? Taxes, of course. And what? The town appraised the property for. And the treasure I buried. 750,000 should be sufficient. Patsy and I were speechless. Hey, just kidding, son. Your family? I haven't asked anyone to leave until you pay the taxes on paper. We will set the price based on the town's appraisal. I believe you want to stick around. So, if you want to look after me until you decide when to plant me, okay, you can have the place. Another thing. If you look around long enough, you might find something worthwhile here. This place holds some secrets. I returned Patsy to the city after renting a car to get around in. That's the best part about being a writer. A person can make his own schedule. My wife was due to return in 3 days with the girls, Priscilla and Diana. They were 16 and 17. Diana is the oldest. I went into Coleman & Sons' law office, as Philip had directed me, and asked to see the elder Coleman. Philip James wishes to sell his property to me. We've agreed on a price. He needs paperwork completed. Would you drive out to see him? I understand that he has previously used your services. That's correct. You know, the place is pretty run down, and it's going up for tax sale soon. Yes, I understand. I'm going to the town treasurer's office to pay back taxes. It's been in the family for so long. I should be able to get a clear title once he gives you the property description. Would you check to see if there are any arguments against it? I do not want any surprises. I'm sort of family, but he could have forgotten something. What has he been living on for all these years? You mentioned your family. I did not think he had any left. I had no idea about him until I was in the town clerk's office yesterday. The town clerk informed me about him. I went to see him at the nursing home, and they were about to kick him out. He is an uncle to my grandmother. In fact, I share most of his name. I am Philip James Hammond. I bet they were prepared to dump him. What was he trying to accomplish? If I know him correctly, he was looking for a woman to be his fifth wife. You inquired as to his current means of subsistence. His third wife owned an annuity, and that is where the money came from. His fourth wife tried to persuade him to hand it over to her, but he was too smart. She was the absolute worst of them all. The money should have been enough to last him. But he's too mean to die. So it is all gone. I do not believe he will ever die. He is something. I almost think he hit on my wife. But she moved too quickly for him. Well, observe him. He still might. I paid my back taxes. And those for this year. This year's payment was not required. But since I was going to own the property, I figured I might as well. I stepped across the aisle and introduced myself to the town clerk, explaining that I had met Philip James, and that we were indeed related. I took him home, and he immediately calmed down. My wife and I stayed there last night. It's great to discover a relative you didn't know about. My grandmother was his niece. That is fantastic, because he requires care. Are you able to help him? I just paid his back taxes. Oh, that is very nice of you. I felt sorry for him because he almost lost his home. When I got home, calling this place home felt so natural. The attorney had come and gone. It's not just home. And happy old Phil had me as his captive audience. He told one story after another about the place. I took everything down. I was thinking about writing his story someday. Or a story about this old house and what happened inside it. When he got tired, he would go take a nap before evening and dinner. I knew where the well that supplied water to the house was located. I was aware that the shade trees in front of the house had been planted. I knew how close the house had been to burning down 40 years ago. It was as if the old man was eager to share the history of my ancestors' home. Mine. He told me about his 4 wives, saying that some were good and one was bad. That was the final one. The shrew assumed I was a ticket to the good life for her. Ellie was wife number 3. Berta, number 4, was aware that I had been left some money. However, she was a wild one in bed, and I had to put up with a lot for a long time because of it. It's too bad she fell down the cellar stairs. I told everyone. I missed her, but not really. I had gotten over her. How long ago did she die? Oh, I do not know. 9 to 10 years ago. So you haven't had a female companion since then? I did not say that. There was a widow down the street who used to stop by. She had needs as well. I tried to make her wife number 5, but she said she wanted to be true to her late husband. She was going to heaven without any complications. She died last year. I've been feeling lonely since then. Did you ever earn enough money here on the farm to support yourself? Nah, we're not big enough. All our family ever did was grow enough food to feed us. They were at home. Everybody worked out somewhere. I used to drive a delivery van for a bread company up to the last. Then I got in an accident, and they took my license. I believe I was 78 years old when this occurred. The company was furious, Because I lied about my age when I accepted the position. I had a difficult time getting my social security issues resolved. I had my wife's money, so I said screw you and didn't draw it. I haven't paid any taxes to the government either. Before we went to bed, he looked at me. You know, this place has some secrets that can never be revealed. You should be familiar with some of the people we sign the papers with. Some are sad, while others are absolutely terrible. I find that I don't get to tell you before I die. My lawyer, old Coleman, will give you a letter, the majority of which will be written down. When I die, you will receive that letter. And don't let anyone see what's inside. Will you promise to do that? I promise. I lay in bed thinking about everything I'd heard throughout the day. Wife number 4 refused to leave. Help hurriedly down the cellar stairs. Patsy arrived with Chris and Dela. I kissed my women, pleased to see them. Ahem. Introduced me to these 2 young women. Philip. Here are my 2 daughters, Priscilla and Diana. This is your great-uncle. Several times. He is also your great-grandmother's uncle. She called him Uncle Pert, and you might as well. Philip looked at Dela, named after my niece. Were you in? You should exchange names with your sister. She's the one who looks like my niece. Dead. Don't make any difference. You both are probably looking. If you head upstairs. The 3rd room on the left was hers before she left with that city slicker. Let me tell you about her and what happened to her. Philip might want to include her name in his tree. This house was incredibly large. It had 6 bedrooms upstairs, not small ones either. The downstairs had a large kitchen across the south end of the house. The kitchen was a communal area where meals were prepared and eaten. There was a sitting room and a pantry that were both the same size. All Phil referred to this as the keeping room. This was where milk was separated, and cream was converted into butter. Bread was also stored on shelves behind a stove used to heat water for washing, and to process meat for storage. During their wedding season, they completed all of their fruit and vegetable canning. On the north end of the house, there was a parlor bedroom. Out back, there was a massive woodshed, where wood for the kitchen was stored empty. There was a brooder house for chicks and a hen house. There was a building with boards about an inch apart. It was a corn crib. There was an open shed on one side with a large wooden tank that was originally filled with water for the stock. The barn was quite large, and it included a stable with 10 to 15 cattle ties. Beyond the stable was a lean-to that had housed calves. There was a pig house with pins coming out of it. There was a massive 24 by 40-foot silo in the stable. The floor was wooden with scuttleboards where cow manure went down into the pit. In the spring, the manure that had been stored over the winter was spread out on the fields. No horses. There must have been a place for them. There was a horse barn and buggy house to the south of the house. It was destroyed by fire in 1937. My brother purchased a tractor that year. At the time, the farm was in decline. Anyway, there's no one to run it. I haven't had much cattle after that either. You can still see where the fields were. They haven't been mowed in 20 years either. I've been cutting wood where I used to raise alfalfa. I used to see down the valley, but now I can't because you're gone. It's handy to cut wood close to the house, so it's not all bad. I missed it. Now that I think of it. The girls were intrigued by their ancient relative. They poked around the house, asking questions about various items they discovered scattered throughout. Not that the place was particularly unkempt, but the drawers and cupboards were jam-packed with tools, kitchen utensils, stuff that the various wives had purchased, loved, accumulated, or used. Old Philip was in his prime. When he wasn't napping, he was surrounded by 2 attractive young women. If you girls want to see how people have dressed over the last 80 years or so, go up to the attic and look through the boxes and trunks. I don't know half of what's in the corners. I put the majority of the old furniture on the north end. I let a dealer up there only once. He nearly went insane when he saw what he dubbed a chest on a chest. I guess he died because he never responded to me with an offer. When you get up there, you should wear your bravery outside where the ghosts can see it so they don't catch you. The old man laughed hilariously. I had to go up with the girls. Patsy refused to go up there. She said this to maintain the illusion of ghosts. But I never heard about her being up there alone. Chris and Dela squealed and pretended to be terrified. But their curiosity won out, and they spent hours up there opening the trunks of clothes and other items. They even discovered some jewelry to wear, which old Phil had stored with each wife's clothes as they were replaced. I examined some, and I believe there is value, which I would like to have looked at someday. In the meantime, the girls dressed in styles popular decades ago. Dela became very excited when they discovered a trunk bearing the name of her great-great-aunt, Diana James Olson. Old Philip had said Chris looked the most like his niece, so she was the one to come down and show him what she had discovered. It brought tears to his eyes. If he hadn't been saying anything, I swear he would have gone crazy and thought Chris was his niece. The first secret was partially revealed that day. Dela lies on the ridge in an unmarked grave. When he said this, tears streamed down his face. Amazed, I inquired as to what had occurred and how her husband had brought her home one night in 1932. She had died. She'd been shot. The car she was riding in was shot at. And the bullet passed through the back and decapitated her. She was so sweet and beautiful. And it was such a crime. Mama was alive, and 3 of my brothers were present. Macy had left and was never informed. Mama laid Dela out on the kitchen table, washing and dressing her. Pop dug her grave. The following morning, just before sunrise, we carried her up and laid her to rest. I told you there were some sad secrets about this place. It was one of them. Why didn't you have a proper funeral? You clearly loved her. Dela left here in 1926. She rode home. Some claimed she had figured out how to truly live. I guess she was quite wild. We were all aware she was a Scarlet Woman. Then she wrote. She was married. I guess she didn't change her lifestyle much. Even married. She used to send Mama some trinkets. Mama would not wear them. They're still kicking around somewhere. If my 4th wife hadn't stolen them. I'll tell you when and why she arrived home that way. Perhaps someday. I am unable to do so today, however. I'm too sad to remember old Philip going and lying down when he got up. None of us could figure out how to bring up the subject again. I had articles to write, so I let my family entertain the elderly man. I expected my girls to be bored, but they seemed to thrive here. They went for walks through the woods. They discovered an old, dilapidated sugar house. And old Phil told everyone about sugaring in it for years. There were only a few timbers left, but the stone arch and grates remained visible. They dug around and found some metal bands that held the wooden buckets together. To the girls, this was history coming to life through the eyes of someone who had witnessed everything. According to Philip, sugaring essentially came to an end after Hurricane 38. A large number of maple trees in the sugar lot had been blown down and never recovered. I also did some poking around. I delved into the various records and journals that had been compiled over the years. There were boxes of them stashed in the attic. I came across sketches of buildings that had been drawn at various points in time when repairs had been completed, or new buildings had been added. When Dela died, the house was packed with relatives, and construction began immediately after she was laid to rest. Apparently, that was when the cows were relocated to an upper level of the barn, and the calf pens were installed near the silo. There were sketches of the silo, but I couldn't tell where the calves had originally been stalled. It appeared that cement had been poured over the ceiling, and the resulting floor served as the base for the hammer. A cement wall was poured the length of the original stable, forming the cattle's manure pit. Above, the end of the building, where the calves had been, was then walled in. Why? It was a mystery. Perhaps it was one of the secrets that old Phil discussed. After studying the sketches, I concluded that there was a fully enclosed space beneath the hammer for the entire length of the barn, and half of the width on the lower level. The silo was located just outside the barn on one end. This was all perplexing, to say the least. Wandering down to the barn, I could clearly see the cement floor because there had been no hay stored there for years. Going down to the pit area, I could see that the cement wall, while old, was significantly newer than the original foundation. I could also see the walled-up end where the calves had been held back. A round silo abutting the base of the silo was raised approximately 9 feet off the ground, so that the staves were approximately level with the stable floor. That made sense for cattle feeding, and I could see how the insulin was transported from the silo to the cattle mangers. Stumbling over the broken boards on the base that had fallen from the rotted silo roof, I could see that the outside of the silo base was lower than the center. This made sense because when corn is inside, the fermented juice that is pressed out is toxic if consumed. As a result, it had to be drained somewhere out of reach of animals. When the fermentation process was complete, there was no danger, which is why the corn was so appealing to livestock. But why is there a flat cover in the center of the silo base? There was even a metal ring in there, obviously for removing the cover. Was there a water well underneath the cover? Did not make sense. I'd have to revisit the silo diagram after returning to the barn. I could see the hay fork and track suspended from the roof's peak, still attached. There was some light rope attached to the trip mechanism. The rope that hauled the loaded hay fork to the top of the barn was missing, which was understandable given that rope had multiple uses on a farm like this. Climbing to the top scaffold, I could look out where moisture was vented, and see over the brush and new growth of trees that surrounded the overgrown acres. The view down the valley was breathtaking. The tree growth would have to stop once some of the building repairs were completed. Making my way through the shaky scaffolding, I wanted to look out the opposite end of the barn, where the hill behind the house was visible. There was a defined path, but it was almost completely overgrown. I assumed it led uphill to Dela's unmarked grave. Despite the fact that I should have been working, I wanted to continue on the path until it ended. I descended from the top of the barn, crossed to the back of the house, and continued up the trail. When I reached the end, I noticed 3 flat stones spaced a few feet apart. 2 were covered in moss, but the third had small pebbles embedded in the ground to keep the stone free of lichens. This must be Dela stone. What about the other 2 stones that lay beneath them? I'm sure old Phil could tell me if he was thinking the same way. We'd been here for over 2 weeks. I had familiarized myself with the buildings below and above. I assumed Chris and Dela spent their time in the hot attic, rummaging through the piled-up items. Don't overdo the mixing. Someday, we might want to catalog the belongings and who owned and wore them. I doubt the boxes are worth much, but the antique clothes could be valuable to a theater group or historical society. Great Aunt Dela had the best stuff. Her trunk was filled with a variety of party attire. Pretty daring, too. I thought women wore floor-length dresses in the 1920s and 1930s. Old Phil spoke up. Many good women did, but some did not. You must remember that it was Prohibition time, and Dela lived it to the fullest. They slaughtered her. It did. He remained silent, thinking about his niece who had gone bad. She wasn't particularly bad. She just ended up running with the wrong crowd. She had no idea what her husband was until after she married him. Marriage meant a lot to her, so she remained with him. I'm guessing he loved her too, for it was he who brought her home. I dared to ask. Could you tell us about the time she arrived home? Some of it, perhaps. She and her husband resided in New York, and that is where she was assassinated. His driver arrived and directed us to his car. It was a large passenger sedan. One of the air-cooled Franklins. Her husband's father ran a speakeasy for someone with ties to a crime family. The old fool was dipping into the till and taking some of the profits. I believe Dela was used to move money out of the joint. Anyway, someone got onto him, and as they were leaving, the owners braced him, resulting in a shootout. Dela, her husband, and a driver were already inside the car. The father had just gotten into the back seat when he was shot. They did not intend to leave any witnesses, so Dela fell victim to a bullet. Her husband had been severely wounded. The driver fled, knowing that he would also be assassinated. Dela's husband had come here a few times. Never welcomed, just tolerated. He lived long enough to direct the driver here, but died a week after bringing Dela home. The father's shooting was never reported in this newspaper. Crime was all too common in cities, including New York. So we buried Dela and waited for her husband's death. We didn't dare to call a doctor for him, and he didn't want one. Phil was growing tired. I had a lot of questions, but I didn't want to push him too much. He abruptly stopped his tale. I am going to bet the rest of it. You will have to wait. He toddled down the hall to his room, leaving us staring behind him. Phil did not wake up the next morning. Patsy gave him some food in bed, and the girls came in every now and then to cheer him up. I asked my daughter, Dela, if she had come across Dela's married name. She went up into the attic and brought down a bunch of letters from the trunk's bottom. His name was Olson. When I learned who she was married to and what the father's name was, I called the newspaper again to see if there was any mention of a speakeasy homicide on the day he died. Old Philip had it correct. The blurb had a third-page headline. Speakeasy manager is dead. Hail of bullets. The shooters are unknown. There were very few details, including none about Olson's family. The reporter appeared to be on the anti-alcohol bandwagon, which dominated the story. The girls were intrigued by the story of their great-aunt and how she died. They were a little concerned about going upstairs to bed that night. Patsy even snuggled closer to me when we went to bed, which made me think she was almost asleep. I went and got cuffed for my troubles, but it brought her closer, so it was worth it. The lawyer arrived the next day with documents transferring ownership. He brought 2 witnesses with him. They wandered around the place until it was time to witness our signatures. Old Phil was out and about, and Coleman said he was looking. So, what was it? The food. His response was that 3 beautiful women were taking care of him. Why wouldn't he be looking good? 3 weeks ago, I had no idea I had a relative or knew anything about my ancestors. Now I lived up in southern Vermont. I noticed that my work was just flowing along, and I was producing more articles in less time. The girls had met a friend who was their age, and would be attending the same school in the fall. Patsy had been admitted to the hospital, and promised to begin work in the fall, when the girls returned to school. The book, which was at the publishers, was scheduled to be released in September. I'd be away promoting it a lot. Old Phil was all for it. He said, 3 women all to myself. A man cannot get any luckier than that. One evening, Old Phil continued the story about Dela's return. Everyone was present when Dela returned home. We made Olson as comfortable as possible. I do not think he wanted to live without Dela. It touched us that he cared so much about her and missed her so much. It changed our perspective on her marriage. Why the hell did he let her end up in a situation where she was crushed? We could not completely forgive the driver. None of us took to everything. He was the elderly man's driver, and he blamed the son for his employer's death. He didn't enjoy country life. And when he started flirting with two of my brother's wives, we knew he needed to leave. He didn't fit in with us at all, and we feared we would be stuck with him forever. In addition, having him around would make us feel embarrassed. He was exactly the type of thug you'd expect. Old Phil paused to think before saying, "You two girls, go down to my room and move that picture of the dog that hangs on the wall at the foot of my bed. Look closely at the wall, and report back to us what you see." Chris and Della went down and then ran back. "There are 2 holes in the wall, 3 inches apart. Is that what you intended?" "Yep. That's another one of the secrets I mentioned this place had. Della's husband helped us by taking care of the driver, Bert. I believe he was called. We parked that driver on the hill, leaving space for Della's husband next to her. When one of you goes up there, you'll notice the flat stones where they all rest. Della is under the one I've kept as nice as possible. But it's been 2 years since I've been up there with anyone. Take care of it after my death." I stated that it would be taken care of. Later, after old Phil had gone to bed, Chris inquired about the holes. "I believe those holes were caused by bullets that went straight through that driver. I believe Olson shot him from the bed as he lay dying. He was just finishing up details before he died. Remember, this was a violent era, and these were not nice people. They did, on occasion, do what was necessary. And the husband accomplished this by removing something that could have caused his wife's family problems. Do not think about it." All too often, we discovered our thoughts. I returned to it, though. I was thoroughly enjoying my summer when old Phil appeared and sat down beside me on the porch. "Are you planning to stay for the winter?" "Yes, of course. It's our home, and we live here." "Why?" "So, I was wondering. You've done nothing to prepare for it yet. And time is wasting. You don't have anything up in the windows that needs to be repaired. You may not realize it, but this place is incredibly hot. I've done pretty well by closing off the upstairs during a cold winter. I've just moved a cot into the kitchen near the stove, and let the rest of the house go crazy. I don't believe you can do that. As I mentioned, I was wondering. I never gave it any thought. I guess I better get going." "You are a good man, Philip. You simply don't know. That is all. You will figure it out." He terrified me. I had money. After all, I'd only paid the back taxes on the property. Everything else was on paper. My income had increased, and I had the prospect of book sales. Patsy was summoned to work by the local hospital about once a week. I acted quickly and had the windows installed, as well as storms on the lower level once the second floor was complete. I didn't want to do much until I decided what our home would look like. We had considered staying at a bed and breakfast. Patsy had suggested heat. That was the problem. I went into a used building supplies store. They dealt with everything. This week's sale featured carpeting at $0.20 per square foot, from a motel that was being renovated. Still good for each 1,000 square feet purchased. They'd lower the price by $0.02. I purchased 2,500 E2 for $0.15 FT, paying less than $400. It was all the same color, but the upstairs was all bedrooms. I didn't even put down the rug. I just laid it on the floor, hoping it would keep the heat from escaping to some extent for the downstairs floors. I purchased some 14 by 16 rugs to cover the majority of the bare floors in each room. I wanted old Phil to be warm. "Philip, how do you like to sleep in the living room? Your room will be warmer than usual. I don't care where I sleep anymore." The modern Murphy bed I'd been eyeing for years was installed in less than a week. It was an elegant piece of furniture that resembled a bookcase when closed during the day. I hung a curtain around it so that old Phil could have his privacy when we walked through. "I believe you want it." Boy, was he tickled. "Murphy. Bed. I had never seen anything like this before. Love it. Hey, I'm right in the middle of things now." His only concern was that it would close while he was asleep. Next, I installed twin beds in old Phil's room, which included a pellet stove. There was a shared chimney between the parlor and this room. I moved the bed. Patsy and I had been sleeping in from upstairs to the parlor, so we installed another small pellet stove. When old Phil saw them, he snuffed. "No way, with that heat. One small room, say nothing about the large rooms. The damn firebox in them. Things aren't big enough to fit anything. You wait. When the cold weather arrives, you will be begging for one. I'll get you one anyway. For the living room. I bet you don't use it on anything other than the lowest setting all winter." We completely blocked off the keeping room, which was located on the west side of the house, and replaced the pantry shelves with kitchen cupboards. When old Phil's birthday arrived, I asked if he wanted anyone invited to his party. "No. You are all I want. Besides, I've outlived almost everyone I ever knew. 93 years old. You know, your family has given me an extra year. If I had stayed in that nursing home, I would have died by now. He cackled as only he could. Of course, they were going to kick me out. You come at the right time, and I appreciate it. I swear I saw tears in his eyes. My desk was in the living room, and I worked from there. The articles I wrote required research, so I would sometimes work for hours on end to find the exact words that the magazine wanted to use to convey my message. When my book hit stores, I was gone for 2 to 3 days at a time. Patsy preferred the night shift at the hospital. The girls were always home at night. Old Phil was no problem at all. He could sit for hours staring into the pellet stove, watching the pellets burn. Other times, he sat in a comfortable chair with an Afghan over his legs. If he got tired, he could crawl into the Murphy bed, which we almost never closed. I adore that thing. You wouldn't want to bury me with it, would you? That was not the only thing that made him happy. Chris and Della would finish their schoolwork and then go shower. By this point, old Phil had crawled onto his bed. The girls would join him, one on either side. They would lie close to him and might even fall asleep. The first few times, the girls did this. I was afraid old Phil would try to take liberties. I asked them if he ever did. They were appalled. Of course not. They were family. How could I have thought of such a thing? But I still watched him at night. Sometimes he would start talking. His generation gravitated toward males. There were 5 boys in the family, and the next generation gravitated toward girls. Old Phil had 4 brothers. Of those who married and had children, 4 girls were born. Maisie, my grandmother, and, of course, Delaware. One more girl child died at birth. After marrying, the 4th child moved out west and disappeared. Maisie had a child. That was my father, and I was his only child. We came to the conclusion that the James family was nearly extinct. Anyway, that's the name. The Hammond name was in roughly the same shape. Oh well. Has it made any difference? After Halloween came Thanksgiving, followed by cold weather. Old Phil's health was deteriorating, and we were all concerned that we might lose him. We were all in the sitting room, just before Christmas. Old Phil sat on the Murphy bed between the girls. Patsy was home that night, and I'd just finished an article. I have one more secret about Philip that you should know. You can look into it sometime. And no, I'm telling you the truth. When you get to fixing up the barn, you'll notice it has an unusual configuration. I can tell you right now that the car Della drove home is buried beneath a portion of the barn. I drove it in right after the people on the hill were taken down. It went into the area where we kept the calves. My brothers were all present at the time, and we worked like hell to wall it in and pour cement so it would never be discovered. The keys are in the ignition, just like when I turned off the engine. It's been 30 years or more since I looked at it. When I went in to look at the car, it had been there for 30 years. I expected it to rot and become a pile of junk, but it remained as beautiful as ever. Of course, I don't know what condition it is currently in. No. Never mind. It will be there forever. The entrance is located in the silo base, correct? How did you know that? I discovered a collection of old sketches depicting the barn change. I wondered why. I also poked around the silo and found what appeared to be a cover. I had no idea what was underneath it. I was thinking about a water wall or something. Philip, you are a pretty sharp boy. Under that cover is a tunnel that leads into the old cafe, where the car is parked. Not very smart. I am just used to figuring things out. I have to write about things and frequently have only sketches to go on. The tunnel was not depicted in the sketch, but it makes sense. You should be aware that there is money in the car. Not much of a treasure, but something, I suppose. His father-in-law stole from everyone and everything he could get his hands on. When you open the trunk, you will discover hundreds of coins, nickels, dimes, quarters, and half-dollars and dollars. They were stolen while in their bags. We got rid of the bags and simply dumped the coins in the trunk. Louis, why haven't you spent them? You had needs. Particularly lately. How was I supposed to get at them? What would have happened if I had gone in and paid my taxes with antique money? Treasure hunters would have ripped this place apart. I guess you were correct. What would have happened if I had not come? I thought about it. It could have been another 60 years before anyone tore into the barn foundation. Perhaps it took days or weeks after the tax sale for someone to notice the cover in the silo. I doubt I could claim any of it, even if I were still alive. Where did you store the car before you got it? Ready to go under the barn? Just put it on the barn floor. But then, when we were pouring cement, we left it in the woods and hoped. I hope no one sees it. You mean? Yep. It didn't take us long to finish the barn. 5 of us boys and Papa. Some of the women even contributed. However, it is hard work. There was no mixer like there is today. So everything was done by hand in a trough. Pour in the sand, stone, and cement, then add water. Mix it with the hose. As I said, damned hard work. What were you afraid of that drove you to do all that work? That driver had absolutely no trust in him. He knew about the coins and wanted them. He claimed he was the one who carried them out and loaded them from the joint. We were well along with the barn when he died, so we simply stuck to the original plan. Wasn't there paper money? We spent some of that. There are no large bills, however. Only ones. 2s, 5s, 10s, 20s, and a few 50s amounted to approximately $13,000 in total. Times were tight, and it came in handy. It lasted until some of my brothers went south to build a boat. Jim. He became excited and joined the army, dying in France. Borden joined the Air Force and was shot down over Germany. Macy's father, Bob, joined the Merchant Marine and traveled aboard one of the ships he helped build. He sank off the coast of Britain. All of this caused MAAM and PAP to collapse in sorrow. Ralph stayed on the farm with me until he grew tired of it and moved to town. He had some treats for my wife at the time, but she was family, so he left. I ended up with some floozy, later years. I was thinking about him. He was 45 years old when he died, in 1945, and he cashed in at a downtown dive known as the 45, named after the street address. I never understood it, but there it was, all for the love of talking. We were all interested because he gave us rare glimpses into not only the past but also our own heritage. Chris and Dela wanted to do something special for old Phil around Christmas time. Do you think he'd mind if we dressed up in Dela's 1920s clothes? According to old Phil, they've been up in the attic since she was brought home. He stated that when he removed the trunk from the car and placed it in the attic, it was standing on end. These cars were massive, so there was plenty of space. I think he'd like that. Do you need help getting it down? The clothes will need to be aired. Perhaps if you wash them gently, they will not fall apart. The trunk has handles on it. Chris and I can get it. We'll need to wear coats because it's freezing up there. Making an old man happy appears to be a lot of trouble. I understand, but it will be worth it. He thinks highly of all of us. He claims he had no idea what living was until you found him and brought him home. What's the trunk like? It's made of wood with copper accents around the corners and in the center. It had a key at one point because it had a lock, but we opened it by simply sliding a catch sideways. We showed you one of the dresses last summer, but it was plain. Those further down are all spangly. Okay, but be careful. If it gets too heavy, I'll come up. Unfortunately, you don't have time to learn some of the dances they performed back then. I'd like to see them myself. The girls can. Patsy agrees to hold the flashlight for them. I stood in the stairwell and watched as all three ascended the stairs to the second floor, then the ones to the attic. I quietly ascended and stood at the bottom of the attic stairs. I could hear the girls giggling as they dragged the trunk towards the opening. Patsy and the flashlight appeared as she stepped beyond it, allowing the girls to come down first. Damn it, Philip. You must stop that. I'm not sure why I put up with you. You wait. Someday, I am going to scare you. Chris and Dela, you began descending the stairs and held it. I will come up and calm things down for you. I saw them swing it out into the opening, and then it came crashing down the stairs. Did it hit you, Daddy? The handle broke. No. I'm okay. Come down right now and help me pick up. The trunk was upside down, with the cover open, and some clothes had spilled out. Within a few minutes, everyone was gathered around the trunk. I leaned down and carefully turned it over, trying not to let any more clothes fall out as I lifted. Some bills tumbled to the floor. I let the trunk fall back and grabbed a bill. The denomination was $500. I turned it over and looked as closely as I could. Hold the light closer, Patsy. It was a Federal Reserve note. Is it any good, Dad? I've never seen money worth so much. I think it's fine if it's not counterfeit. I picked up a few additional bills. They were all the same denomination. They must be good. They have different serial numbers on them. Let's bring the trunk downstairs so we can see what we have. More bills appeared as I finished writing the trunk. I pushed everything in except the bills Patsy was holding, then carried the trunk down to the sitting room and placed it on a table near old Phil's bed. Philip, I believe we just discovered more treasure. What do you have there? That is Dela's old trunk. I put it in the attic myself. It is. The handle snapped when the girls handed it down the stairs. It fell all the way to the bottom. These bills have fallen out, and we believe there are more inside. I wanted to show you what we found. We will do it. Do not keep us waiting. Let me. Daddy. It was our idea to open the trunk. Chris and Dela took turns removing their dresses and gowns. When they came across a handful of money, they handed it to Patsy, who straightened it out. Philip, you should look at this. This is a $1,000 bill. Good God. How much is there? Patsy never swore, so I knew she was thrilled. When all of the clothes were out, we could see that the bottom of the trunk was incorrect. The bottom was designed to fit snugly into a slot, leaving approximately an inch of hidden space beneath it. This was where the money had been until the trunk tumbled down the stairs, revealing the hidden compartment. We counted all the bills and found $50 on 1,000 notes. 87 of the $500 and 300 of the $100 bills. The bills were worth $124,500 in face value. Is the money good? This was old Phil's question. I believe so. U.S. currency is perpetually valid and retains its face value. However, a collector would pay at least twice, if not 3 times, as much for this. I paused, smiling, and assumed you were broke. You're wealthy. No, I am not. Send the girls to school. Fix up the place after I leave. Go on a cruise. Too much money, particularly stolen money, causes nothing but trouble. How did the money get into her trunk? She passed away the same night it was stolen. There was a diary or journal at the bottom with the money. Perhaps that will tell us. Patsy waved a book at us while speaking. We focused on the last few entries. The story became immediately clear. Her father-in-law had been planning this for a long time. It had taken him years to figure out the combination to the establishment's second safe. He set out to make the place appear to have been robbed in order to steal all of the money. He extracted the large denomination bills at noon, knowing that the safe would not be opened again that day. He gave Dela the money to put in the trunk he had provided. The plan was, as Dela stated, to return after hours. He, Dela's husband, and the driver were to complete the day's take and withdraw the remaining funds from both safes. This appears to be what the journal revealed. We made a guess at this. Dela was sitting in the car when the owner arrived. They must have opened fire, slaying her, her father-in-law, and injuring Olson. The driver was the only one who managed to escape and save himself, driving the car to Vermont. This was all conjecture. How did they get away? Nobody would ever know. I mentioned it aloud. I know Dela's husband stated that there were only 2 men shooting, with the driver dead and one husband firing at the other. He was unsure whether that one had been assassinated or not. If you ever go in to see the car, you will discover that it was a bloody mess. Dela. Of course. Blood was all over the back seat, and her husband bled on the front passenger seat. Even if we had wanted to, cleaning a brand new car would have been nearly impossible. Did you say it was a brand new car? Yep. The speedometer showed less than 300 miles. We suspected that was why the car was never found here. Dela and her husband had visited here, so we expected someone to show up and ask questions. Dealers used to be able to give driving lessons and process registrations. There were no actual motor vehicle departments. If the crooks didn't know her father-in-law had purchased a new car, they wouldn't be looking for one. What was the inside like? In comparison to today's automobiles, this was relatively simple. There are only 3 or 4 dials on the dashboard. There are a lot of fines. How about the dashboard, doors, and vertical posts? The seats and doors were upholstered with cloth, and the floor was covered in carpet. That's why it would have been difficult to clean. What color was, or should I say is still, there? It was a dark forest green. If you see it, you'll be curious about the tire size. The dimensions were 31 by 6.2, and the brake drums were 14 inches larger than some modern wheels. It is a massive vehicle with a wheelbase of 128 inches. The tire, fenders and bumper add up to 12 to 14 feet. There could be more, as this one has a spare tire on the back. All I could think of was, wow. Someday I'd go down into that hiding place and look at it. Old Phil was exhausted the next day, and slept while I worked on an article at my desk across the room. I looked up briefly and saw his eyes open. I went over and sat on the Murphy bed beside him. He had tears in his eyes as he spoke about his niece. I loved her, you know. It was never declared, and we never touched each other, but it was present. That's why she went away. I was the youngest of her uncles, just 3 days older than her. We grew up together. We went to school together, danced, and did things that brothers and sisters do. She wasn't my sister, but we were extremely close as uncle and niece. That explains why she calls me Uncle Pert. Our parents recognized her feelings for me, and insisted that she address me as uncle whenever we were alone. Uncle Pert has become an endearing term. She finally couldn't take it anymore and left. I have only seen her 3 times. After 8 years she was gone. She left alive when we were 17 and died when she was 25. I last saw her alive when she came up from New York for her honeymoon. That was 4 years after she'd left home. I married my first wife just 2 months after her honeymoon, but I never forgot Dela. I still remember her as the woman I adored the most. Now that I've gotten that off my chest, I'm ready to die. I have one request. Would you place a stone over Dela's grave? I'd like to be buried next to her with a small stone that simply says Uncle Pert on it. Your family and mine share my blood. So I suppose you'd be the one to do it. Uncle Pert, I most certainly will. Do you want me to do anything else? Just set up a Christmas tree in this room so I can look at it. Perhaps the girls could sing Silent Night for me while I look at the lights. I'd like that. I didn't tell Patsy about my conversation with old Phil. She was completely engrossed in the journal found at the bottom of the trunk and began reading it when she got home that night. The entries were not consistently timed. Della seemed to write when she was lonely, happy, or thinking about home. She described leaving for New York at the urging of one of her school teachers who was traveling there. The teacher was going to meet his fiancée and was traveling with Della. There was no real plan, just that she needed to get away from the Vermont farm. How it occurred. She didn't say anything, but she soon became engrossed in the nightlife and talked about various escorts who took her dancing. She appeared to enjoy the lifestyle at first, but soon craved the peace and quiet of home. By this point, it was too late, and she had become, as she put it, a fallen woman. She talked about her father and mother, Jim and Elsie, and her cousin Maisie, but mostly about Uncle Pert, knowing she'd never be able to return to her simple life. She married a man who transported booze from Canada. Her husband's father operated a speakeasy. The owners ran a trucking company that handled alcohol and owned the illegal nightclub. It was the classic tale of a small-town girl being drawn to the big city and seduced into a life that prevented her from returning to her hometown. Patsy read us excerpts that were interesting to us. Everything she read about Uncle Pert made old Phil happy or sad, depending on the author's feelings about Della's status as a fallen woman. Her kindness shone through as she spoke about various people. She assisted many young girls who were new to town, just like her. She described the wonderful feeling she had when a girl she mentored returned home. After Della's advice was followed, the Wall Street crash turned the world upside down, and her father-in-law appears to have decided on his scheme of stealing from the owners and fleeing with as much money as possible. Do you have any plans to visit Napa Valley in the West? Della said she despised the man because he kept his son trapped in a criminal lifestyle. She agreed to the scheme because she believed it would get her husband away from those who controlled them. But, in any case, Della played an important role in his grand theft operation, as he used her to hide the money. It all ended in a shootout that destroyed at least 3, and possibly 4 people, with 2 more dying as a result, according to Phil. When Patsy had finished her journal, my niece did some bad things, but I believe she was a good woman. I still miss her. Later that night, Patsy and I discussed it. I recounted the conversation old Phil had with me in the afternoon. He loved her, and I hope the good Lord sees fit to reunite them in the afterlife. Patsy agreed. I do, too. Patsy and the kids joined me the day before Christmas to look for a spruce tree in the woods. We were all on snowshoes, as it had snowed twice in the previous week. It appeared that someone knew we were looking for a special tree. We had only been out for about a half hour when we came across a beautiful tree, and we all agreed that it was perfect. When I returned to the house, I took a stand for it right there, with old Phil watching. The girls had purchased lights and tinsel and decorated, while Patsy made hot chocolate to keep us warm. We each went to get the presents we had bought and placed them under the tree. After a light meal, Chris and Della went to put on Della's dresses, and we gathered around the Christmas tree to sing. Patsy had a keyboard to help us with our efforts. We all wanted to give old Phil something that would express how much he meant to us. In the few months we had spent with him, we took a break from our songfest to gather around the Murphy bed. Uncle Pert, we've got something for you. Chris handed him a 9 by 13 portrait of her, wearing one of Della's white gowns. He frequently commented that she resembled her ancestor from long ago. We had induced a photographer to take a portrait of Chris that looked antique, as if it were from the 1920s. Patsy, who had studied Della's hand from the journal, inscribed the portrait with the uncle's name at the top and love, Della near the bottom. Old Phil clutched the picture to his heart and whispered, "Thank you," through tears of love and gratitude. We returned to the Christmas tree and sang Silent Night, Holy Night, as he had requested. I've received my present, and it's the best one ever. What did you give one another? Old Phil spoke from his bed, where he lay motionless, completely happy and immersed in the Christmas scene. Let's open all of our presents tonight rather than in the morning. Patsy went over to the tree and chose gifts for the girls. None of us were particularly interested in material possessions, so the majority of the gifts were clothing, utensils, and tools that we would use around the farm or house in the coming months. The presents from under the tree were all distributed. Patsy had sent me nothing. She has always surprised me in the years I've been with her, and this year was no different. Philip, your uncle has your present. I looked at old Phil, who held a folder in his hand. He was bursting with joy as he handed it to me. He said, "Congratulations. Philip. This should make you pleased. I opened it and found a sonogram. A fetal negative. Now there are 2 fetuses. Patsy smiled. That's correct. Philip. Did you think I was getting fat? This time, we're having twins. The girls had not been informed, but they were as excited as I was. Old Phil was the one who was most excited. It was as if he was about to be the father. This old house needs to be filled again. And you're well on your way to making it happen. When it was time to go to bed, old Phil remained wide awake. Patsy and the girls kissed him on the cheek and said goodnight. He clasped my hand and said, "You have an amazing family, and I am glad I was a part of it." I remembered him using the past tense and saying goodnight to me, but not until I found him in the morning. His soul had left us that night. We all shed a few tears, but we knew he wouldn't want us to mourn on Christmas Day. The authorities did not come for him until late in the day. We were all sitting in the room, and he was still in the bed across the room. By the time they arrived to pick him up, we'd all said our goodbyes and moved on from the majority of our grief. I handed the funeral director an envelope containing instructions on how Phil wanted his remains disposed of. Nothing but a newspaper announcement was planned until spring, when he would be brought home and buried alongside his niece. Mr. Coleman, the lawyer who had drawn up the documents, invited us into his office. I assumed that he and old Phil respected each other and that Mr. Coleman had listened to what was requested and given old Phil his best advice. The main point was the form title itself. It had been transferred to the Hammonds, Patsy and Philip. The farm payment was anonymously donated to various charities, and no record was kept. There was a receipt indicating that the 87-acre house, various outbuildings, and whatever was inside them at the time of sale had been paid for in full. The lawyer was also charged with ensuring that Philip James was cared for until his death, and that his final wishes regarding the disposition of his remains were carried out. Mr. Coleman gave us a statement attesting to the fact that we had met all of the above obligations. My publisher begged me to write another book, after my book sales were successful. I had material on hand, based on what old Phil had told me in the Dallas Journal, for the Roaring Twenties prohibition, in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash. I applied for, and was granted permission by the authorities to have the area where Dela was buried, a designated private burial site. Uncle Pert visited his niece in late May. We waited until after the twins were born, so Patsy could make it up the hill for the simple ceremony. When I was in New York with my publisher, I took one of the $500 notes to a bank and inquired about its authenticity. It was, and I was questioned thoroughly about where I had obtained it. I just said I found it in an old trunk while cleaning out the attic of a house I recently bought. I did not leave my name. I did take a list of collectors who expressed interest in purchasing the note from me. We put all of the notes in a safe deposit box at a local bank, and they are still there. I'm not sure if we'll ever sell them or even reveal that we own them. I am having the house completely renovated. We still live downstairs, and every day we walk by the Murphy bed, remembering old Phil. It has been an excellent place for the twins to take their afternoon naps. Summertime. We do move upstairs, so that the breeze can circulate throughout the house and keep it cool. I found a local logger who needed wood for his customers. I made an agreement to give him the wood if he clear-cut the land that was once a field 100 years ago. I worked hard on my book, and it flowed seamlessly. I initially thought it would be a novella, but after researching some of the places in the book mentioned by Dela, I expanded it to a full-length novel. Dela graduated in June. That first year, we were in Vermont. What do you want for a graduation present? I want the tunnel's cover to come off so that I can see the car. It'll be terrifying going in there, Dad. Get real. Mom is the only one who would become scared. She wouldn't, either, if you hadn't tried so hard to make her nervous like that. I am aware, but I have an ulterior motive. Notice how she clings to me when she's scared. You try that on me, and I'll clobber you. So, will I get to see the car or not? Yes, but you'll need to help clear the silo base. I do not want to get rid of it. Just set it aside so we can put it back when we get out. Could we start this afternoon? I constructed a tripod and suspended a chain. Falls from it to remove the cover from the opening, revealing stone steps leading down into the earth's bowels. All 3 of us were equipped with battery-powered lanterns. Chris and Dela, please allow me to lead the way. Patsy refused to look down from the entrance and instead sat on the silo foundation, nursing the twins. She held a cell phone, ready to call for help if we got into trouble. Ghosts. To be honest, I was anxious as well. Fear of the unknown. Perhaps it had been more than 30 years. According to old Phil, it had been dry since anyone had descended these steps, which I expected to be moist. Then I remembered how difficult it had been to raise the cover, and how tightly it fit at the bottom of the stairs. I could see where a drain led beneath the stairs. so it was intended to stay dry. There was a slight incline leading to a narrow wooden door. There was no lock, only a thumb latch to open it. The girls had descended the stairs and stood close behind me. "Are you ready?" I asked. Then I pressed the latch and pushed open the door. I'm not sure what I expected. The car was there, exactly as old Phil had predicted. I swung the lantern around. It was a very spacious area. I could see that the calf pen was still down. What would be the exterior wall? The area had evidently been thoroughly cleaned. I expected everything to be dusty, but it wasn't. The massive car sat there with some dust on it, but light reflected off the vertically painted surfaces. Chris and Della pushed me forward into the room. Curious to see, we entered and walked around the vehicle. I revised my estimate of the car's length, believing it had to be 15 feet or more. It was parked closest to the manure pit wall, but there was still enough space to open the doors. Chris opened the driver's door and climbed in, making Birmingham sounds and twisting the steering wheel. "Are you okay down there?" Patsy had arrived at the top of the stairs and heard the word press. "We're fine. The only issue with the car is that the tires are flat. The car is stunning." I walked around to the right side and called out to Patsy, "Except for the bullet holes." Patsy squealed. I opened all of the doors to reveal the bloodstains that old Phil had told us were protein. He had taken care of them, leaving only a darkening on the upholstery. I'd never seen an air-cooled engine before, and was curious to see the motor. So I lifted the hood. The hood rose from the side, rather than the front, as is common in modern automobiles. I could see individual cylinders, 6 in a row. The top was covered to allow for airflow. I had to pass by them to do the cooling. In the meantime, Della had opened the trunk, which pretty much described it. Not much more than a metal box held together by straps between the back seat and the spare tire. "Dad, take a look at the money." I closed the hood and went to see what she was so excited about. The bottom of the trunk was covered with about 4 inches of coins. The trunk measured 4 feet long and 16 inches wide. You could fit a lot of money in that much space. The coins were all silver. I picked up one and examined it. The dollar was dated 1897. More treasure. I walked around the empty space. The James family had meticulously prepared their hiding place. They had laid oak timbers on top of the walls, then planked over them and sealed everything with cement. This cellar was built 69 years ago, and is drier than most. It had preserved the car, and aside from the tires, it was exactly as it had been driven in here. "Girls, I am going to get my camera and photograph this." They followed me to the foot of the stairs as I returned with the camera. Both had returned inside, and were sitting in the car again, unconcerned now that the unknown had passed. "Della, go up and convince her mother to come down and see this. You look after the twins while she does." Patsy spoke from just outside, which surprised me. "Come get me, Philip. I will come in if you promise not to scare me." I wanted my wife to have this experience with me, so I was on my best behavior. I took photographs of everything. I even captured some footage of Priscilla sitting in the back seat, pretending to be dead. Patsy even laughed when Pris stuck her tongue out the side of her mouth and fixed her gaze as we imagined her journey all the way from New York. Like this. Were we irreverent? I do not think so. Okay, maybe a little, but we needed to keep the mood light, or we would reflect on the tragedy that had occurred. I grabbed a pocketful of coins for souvenirs, and we went out to replace the cover. I wasn't sure when we would return. The trip down to see the car motivated me to work harder and faster on the book I was writing. I guess I neglected my twin sons while I was doing this. Priscilla was in her final year of high school. Diana was at UVM, having fully adopted Vermont as her preferred state and leaving Connecticut in the distant past. This is how we all felt. When I finished, I sent the manuscript to my publisher and received an email back from him. "Where did you get the idea for such an unbelievable story? It'll never sell. I thought you wrote better than this. Call me when you have something new that I'd be interested in." I showed him pictures of the car, making sure they showed bullet holes. I sent pictures of old Phil and the graves on the hill with the monuments and stones I had placed. I had a picture of old Phil in the Murphy bed, dressed in one of Della's dresses. I even showed the trunk with its broken handle. I added a note to all of this. Truth is sometimes stranger than fiction and more difficult to deal with. I'm confident that when I return to fiction, I'll be able to market this true story. If another publisher isn't interested, I'll definitely call my publisher, Philip James Hammond, who originally thought this story would not sell, decided it had merit after all. He found me an agent, and my agent is currently working to get the book picked up by the film industry. My 6-year-old twins lead the tour down under the barn to see the car. When people ask if the tale I wrote was true, I had some fake coins made that say "souvenir of this old house" on one side and feature a likeness of Dela on the other. The coins are stored in a secure section of the bank vault. and I plan to have them appraised someday. Oh, and my 5-year-old daughter runs up to me and says, "Daddy, these people want you to autograph your book." The only section not included in the book was about Federal Reserve notes. Nobody needs to know about those. Was it something else, or simply luck, that brought me to town 7 years ago to look up my ancestors? It leaves you wondering, doesn't it?